Margaret Lawson had always been the first person to remember a birthday. For decades, friends joked that she never needed a calendar. She remembered anniversaries, grandchildren's graduations, church events, and even the names of neighbors who had moved away years before. At 76, she still lived alone in the colonial home she and her late husband, Richard, had purchased 43 years earlier. She paid her own bills, drove herself to the grocery store, volunteered every Wednesday at the local library. Life had slowed with age, but it had never stopped. Then, almost without warning, people began looking at her differently. It started during her granddaughter Emily's birthday dinner. The restaurant buzzed with conversation as Margaret laughed while telling an old family story. Before she could finish, her son, Daniel, smiled apologetically at everyone around the table. "What Mom means," he said gently, "is that happened when Emily was 5, not 7. Margaret blinked. "No, sweetheart," she replied. "She was 7. Daniel gave a patient little chuckle. "It's okay, Mom. We all mix things up sometimes." The table fell quiet. Emily glanced awkwardly at her husband. Someone changed the subject. Margaret smiled politely, but something about the moment unsettled her. She had been certain she was right. When she returned home later that night, she opened an old photo album. There it was. Emily blowing out 7 candles. She had remembered correctly. A week later it happened again. Margaret greeted her longtime neighbor Linda while collecting the morning mail. Before Linda could answer, Daniel pulled into the driveway. He rolled down the window. "Morning, Linda." He laughed softly. "Mom forgot you told her yesterday that you're leaving for Florida tomorrow." Margaret frowned. "No, I didn't." Linda offered an uncomfortable smile. "It's all right, Margaret." Daniel looked at his mother with gentle concern. "I've been noticing little memory slips lately. They're becoming more frequent." Margaret stared at him. "I remember perfectly well." "I'm sure you think you do." His voice was calm, kind, almost impossible to challenge. Over the following months, those small comments multiplied. At church, Mom gets confused in crowded places. At the pharmacy, she's been forgetting her medications. At family gatherings, if she repeats herself, just be patient. Every sentence sounded caring, protective, reasonable. No one questioned him. Why would they? Daniel Lawson was a respected financial advisor. He volunteered with senior charities. He never raised his voice. He never appeared impatient. He simply spoke with quiet confidence, and people believed him. Margaret slowly noticed something even more painful. Friends stopped asking her questions. Instead, they asked Daniel, "Can Margaret still drive? Has the doctor confirmed dementia? Should we call you instead of her?" She stood beside them while they discussed her as though she weren't there. It was as if she had become invisible. One afternoon, after Bible study, a woman she'd known for 20 years gently squeezed her hand. "Don't worry, dear. My mother had dementia too." Margaret forced a smile. "I don't have dementia." The woman looked toward Daniel. He sighed sadly. "One of the hardest parts is that many patients don't realize anything is wrong." The woman's expression immediately changed from sympathy to pity. Margaret felt something inside her break. That evening, she confronted her son. "Why are you telling people I'm losing my mind?" Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "I'm not." "Yes, you are. I'm telling them what I've observed." Margaret folded her arms. "And what exactly have you observed?" "You forget conversations. You misplace things. You get frustrated more easily." Margaret laughed in disbelief. "I'm 76. I occasionally misplace my reading glasses." "So do you." Daniel didn't laugh. "I'm worried about you." "No." She stepped closer. "You're convincing everyone else to worry about me." His expression softened. "I'd rather people think I'm overreacting than ignore the signs." There it was again. That calm, reasonable voice. The kind of voice that made her sound emotional simply for disagreeing. Margaret suddenly understood why no one questioned him. He never sounded controlling. He sounded compassionate. A few days later, Margaret arrived at her family doctor's office for what she believed was her annual checkup. The receptionist smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Lawson. We've already prepared the paperwork for your neurological evaluation." Margaret frowned. "My what?" "The memory assessment." She blinked. "I didn't schedule one." The receptionist looked confused. "Your son called last week. He said your symptoms had become significantly worse." Margaret's heartbeat quickened. "He can't schedule medical tests for me. I'm afraid everything has already been approved." Before Margaret could respond, Daniel walked through the clinic doors carrying 2 coffees. "There you are, Mom." He smiled as though nothing were unusual. "I know you were nervous, but this will help everyone understand what's going on." Margaret stared at him. "I never agreed to this." Daniel gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be afraid. We're just trying to help." Several patients sitting in the waiting room looked up. Some smiled sympathetically. Others shook their heads with quiet understanding. Margaret slowly removed his hand from her shoulder. For the first time in her life, she realized the greatest threat to her independence wasn't a disease. It was the terrifying possibility that everyone she loved would believe she had one. As the nurse opened the examination room door and called her name, Margaret looked around the waiting room. Every pair of eyes carried the same expression. Not suspicion. Not hostility. Pity. And in that moment, she understood something that frightened her more than growing old. Once people believed you were losing your mind, every word you spoke became evidence against you. The neurological evaluation lasted nearly 2 hours. Margaret answered every question with quiet confidence. She remembered the date, the name of the president, the names of her grandchildren. She repeated lists of words, solved simple puzzles, drew a clock, and recalled a short story after several minutes. When the examination ended, Dr. Alan Foster smiled reassuringly. "You did very well, Mrs. Lawson." Margaret felt the tightness in her chest begin to ease. "So, I don't have dementia?" The doctor chose his words carefully. "Everyone experiences occasional forgetfulness as they age. But based on today's examination, I don't see evidence suggesting moderate or advanced dementia." Relief washed over Margaret. For one brief moment, she believed everything would return to normal. She was wrong. Outside the examination room, Daniel stood the moment the door opened. "How did she do?" Dr. Foster offered a professional smile. "Mrs. Lawson performed well today." Daniel frowned ever so slightly. "But you've only seen her for a few hours." "I live with this every day." Margaret quickly corrected him. "You don't live with me." Daniel smiled politely. "I mean, I'm with her almost every day." He turned back toward the physician. "She forgets conversations. She misplaces important documents. Sometimes she becomes angry for no reason." Dr. Foster listened without interrupting. "Those concerns deserve attention," he replied. "But today's assessment doesn't support severe cognitive impairment." Daniel nodded. "Maybe she's just having a good day." Margaret noticed the doctor's expression change. A seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, Daniel became even more attentive. He insisted on driving Margaret to appointments. "You shouldn't worry about traffic." He offered to organize her medications. "I don't want you missing a dose." He volunteered to pay her monthly bills online. "It'll save you the trouble." To friends and neighbors, his devotion looked admirable. "What a wonderful son. She's lucky to have you." Daniel always answered modestly, "I'm only doing what any son would." Margaret smiled whenever people praised him, but something inside her refused to settle. His kindness felt calculated, as though every helpful gesture quietly took something away. Not her money. Not yet. Her independence. One Tuesday morning, Margaret searched nearly an hour for her reading glasses. She checked the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom, even the refrigerator. Finally, frustrated, she called Daniel. "I can't find them anywhere." "I'll come over." 20 minutes later, he walked straight into the living room. Without hesitation, he reached behind a decorative vase on the fireplace mantel. "There they are." Margaret stared. I already looked there. They were probably hiding. He smiled warmly. It happens. She thanked him. But after he left, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She had moved that vase herself while dusting. She was certain the glasses hadn't been there. Similar moments became strangely frequent. Her house keys disappeared for an entire afternoon before reappearing inside a cereal box. The television remote turned up beneath folded towels in the linen closet. Important appointments somehow vanished from the calendar hanging in the kitchen. Every time something went missing, Daniel happened to arrive and find it within minutes. Then, almost casually, he'd say, "Mom, this is exactly what I've been worried about." The words sounded compassionate. But after hearing them enough times, Margaret began asking herself a terrifying question. Am I really forgetting these things? The answer became harder to trust. One afternoon, Margaret arrived 45 minutes late for lunch with two longtime friends. "I'm so sorry," she said breathlessly. "I thought we were meeting at 1. Linda looked confused. "We've always planned noon." Margaret pulled the appointment card from her purse. Written neatly across it were the words, 1 p.m. Linda frowned. "I wrote noon." Margaret looked at the handwriting. It wasn't Linda's. It looked remarkably like Daniel's. A chill ran through her. That evening she searched through her desk drawer for her checkbook. Instead, she found several unopened bank statements. She always opened them the day they arrived. Always. When Daniel stopped by later that evening, she held them up. "Why are these still sealed?" Daniel barely glanced at them. "You probably forgot." "I don't forget my finances." He gently took the envelopes from her hands. "I'll handle them." Margaret immediately reached for them. "No." Daniel hesitated before returning the papers. For just an instant, his pleasant smile disappeared. Then it returned. "Of course. I was only trying to help." A few days later, Margaret visited Dr. Foster for a routine follow-up. Before the appointment ended, she quietly asked, "Doctor, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." She hesitated. "If someone kept telling you that your memory was getting worse, could you eventually start believing it?" Dr. Foster leaned back thoughtfully. "Yes. It's actually more common than many people realize." Margaret looked surprised. "Really?" He nodded. "When people repeatedly question your memory, especially someone you deeply trust, you can begin doubting your own perceptions." He studied her carefully. "Why do you ask?" Margaret almost told him everything. About the missing glasses, the changed appointment, the misplaced keys. Instead, she simply smiled. "I was curious." The doctor wasn't convinced. As Margaret stood to leave, he quietly said, "Mrs. Lawson, if something doesn't feel right, don't ignore that feeling." 3 weeks later, a thick certified envelope arrived in Margaret's mailbox. She assumed it was another insurance notice. Instead, she found legal documents bearing the seal of the county court. She adjusted her glasses and slowly began reading. Petition for appointment of legal guardian. Petitioner, Daniel Lawson. Grounds, progressive cognitive decline rendering Margaret Lawson incapable of managing her financial and personal affairs. The room seemed to spin. She read the words again and again. Attached were sworn statements describing her as confused, vulnerable, and unable to make responsible decisions. She felt her knees weaken. Her own son wasn't simply telling people she had dementia anymore. He was asking a judge to declare it as fact. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence caught her eye. "A hearing has been scheduled 30 days from today." Margaret slowly lowered the papers onto the kitchen table. Outside, the afternoon sun still shone through the windows. Birds still sang in the maple tree. The world looked exactly the same. But inside that quiet house, everything had changed. She finally understood why Daniel had been so patient. Why he had wanted to manage her bills. Why every misplaced item had become another story to tell. He wasn't preparing to care for her. He was preparing to replace her. And unless someone believed her before the hearing, she wasn't just in danger of losing her home. She was about to lose the legal right to decide her own life. Margaret Lawson barely slept the night after the court documents arrived. The petition lay open on her dining room table, illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp. She had read every page at least a dozen times. Each sentence described a woman she no longer recognized, unable to consistently manage finances, increasingly confused regarding time and place, at risk of exploitation due to cognitive decline. It was as though someone had written the biography of a stranger. Yet beneath every allegation appeared the same signature: Daniel Lawson, her own son. Margaret folded the papers with trembling hands. For the first time since Richard's death 6 years earlier, she admitted something she had never imagined possible. She could not fight this alone. The following morning, she drove across town to the office of attorney Sarah Mitchell. The brass plaque outside the building read, "Sarah Mitchell, Elder Law and Estate Litigation." The receptionist welcomed Margaret with a warm smile before leading her into a quiet office lined with shelves of legal books. Sarah Mitchell stood to greet her. She appeared to be in her early 60s, calm and attentive, with silver hair neatly tied back. She didn't begin by asking about the lawsuit. Instead, she asked a different question. "Mrs. Lawson, how are you holding up?" Margaret's composure collapsed. For several moments, she simply cried. Not because she was afraid of losing the case, but because someone had finally asked how she felt instead of questioning whether she remembered. When Margaret finished explaining everything, from the birthday dinner to the neurological evaluation, Sarah remained silent for a long moment. Then she asked, "Has any physician formally diagnosed you with dementia?" "No." "Alzheimer's disease?" "No." "Mild cognitive impairment?" "No." Sarah nodded slowly. "Good." Margaret looked confused. "Good?" "It means the court petition is built primarily on observations rather than medical conclusions." She reached for the neurological report. Dr. Alan Foster's assessment was clear. No evidence of moderate or advanced dementia. Sarah smiled faintly. "This report helps us. But it isn't enough." "Why not?" Margaret asked. Sarah folded her hands. "Because guardianship cases are often decided by patterns. If enough people testify that you've become forgetful, the judge may conclude you need protection despite one normal examination." Margaret lowered her eyes. "Everyone believes Daniel." Sarah nodded. "That's exactly what concerns me." She leaned forward. "I've handled elder abuse cases for 25 years. There are usually two possibilities. The first is that concerned family members honestly misinterpret ordinary aging." Margaret swallowed. "And the second?" Sarah's expression became serious. "Someone deliberately creates the appearance of incapacity." The words hung heavily in the room. Margaret whispered, "You think my son is doing that?" Sarah answered honestly, "I don't know. But I intend to find out." Over the next several days, Sarah began interviewing people who knew Margaret. The librarian where Margaret volunteered every Wednesday smiled when asked about her. "Margaret organizes our historical archives. If she had serious memory problems, I would have noticed months ago." Her pastor offered a similar answer. "She still leads Bible discussions. Sometimes she remembers scripture better than I do." Even Margaret's mail carrier laughed gently. "Mrs. Lawson reminds me when I'm running late." None of their observations matched Daniel's description. Yet every close family member insisted Margaret was declining rapidly. The contradiction troubled Sarah deeply. A week later, Sarah and Margaret visited Dr. Alan Foster together. The physician reviewed Margaret's test results once again. "I've repeated portions of the examination." He smiled reassuringly. "Mrs. Lawson's performance remains remarkably consistent." Sarah asked quietly, "Doctor, based solely on your evaluations, would you recommend legal guardianship?" Dr. Foster answered without hesitation, "No." Sarah looked relieved. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" "I would." Margaret felt hope for the first time in weeks. As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah suddenly stopped. "Something still doesn't fit." Margaret looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Sarah thought carefully. "Daniel's descriptions are too specific. He claims you've misplaced documents, forgotten appointments, lost important belongings." She looked directly at Margaret. "Have those things actually happened?" Margaret hesitated. "Yes. But only recently." Sarah frowned. "When did they begin?" Margaret thought for a moment. "After Daniel started visiting almost every day." Neither woman spoke. The silence itself became an answer. "That afternoon, Sarah visited Margaret's next-door neighbor, Frank Collins. After answering a few routine questions, Frank suddenly remembered something. "You know, there is one thing." Sarah looked up. "My security camera." "What about it?" "It points toward both our driveways. I've seen Daniel stopping by several times, even when Margaret wasn't home." Sarah's attention sharpened. Would the camera have recorded those visits? Frank nodded. "It saves everything for about 6 months." Sarah exchanged a glance with Margaret. Neither said a word. Frank disappeared into the house and returned carrying a small external hard drive. "I've never watched most of it, but if it helps Margaret, you're welcome to it." Later that evening, Sarah connected the drive to her laptop. Hours of ordinary footage passed by. Delivery trucks, neighborhood children riding bicycles, mail carriers, dog walkers. A familiar SUV pulled into Margaret's driveway. The timestamp showed a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret was volunteering at the library. Daniel stepped out of his vehicle. He looked around the quiet street, then unlocked the front door with his own key. Sarah frowned. "He told the court he only visited when you asked." Margaret nodded slowly. "I never called him that day." Daniel disappeared inside. 28 minutes later, he emerged carrying nothing. He locked the door and drove away. Sarah immediately opened another recording. 2 days later, the same thing happened again. Then again the following week. Each visit lasted between 20 and 40 minutes. Always while Margaret was away. Always alone. Margaret's heartbeat quickened. What was he doing inside my house? Sarah stared at the screen, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet." She paused the video on a frame showing Daniel slipping the key back into his pocket. But whatever he was doing, he never expected anyone else to be watching. Sarah looked at Margaret with renewed determination. 4 weeks, you've been asking people to believe your memory." She closed the laptop. "I think it's time we let the evidence speak instead." Outside, the evening sky darkened over the quiet neighborhood. Neither woman realized that the recordings they had just uncovered were only the beginning. Hidden within those silent videos was the first thread of a deception that, once unraveled, would bring the entire guardianship case crashing down. Sarah Mitchell hardly slept that night. The security footage played over and over in her mind. Daniel Lawson hadn't entered his mother's house once. He had entered repeatedly. Always while Margaret was volunteering at the library, attending church, or meeting friends. Always when no one expected him to be there. That wasn't the behavior of a concerned son checking on his elderly mother. It was the behavior of someone making sure no one would witness what happened inside. "There has to be more," Sarah whispered as she reopened the laptop. The following morning, Margaret arrived carrying a notebook. "I made a list." Sarah looked up. "A list?" "Every strange thing that's happened during the last 6 months." She handed it over. Reading glasses disappeared. House keys found inside the pantry. Medication bottles moved into different cabinets. Doctor appointments written on the wrong dates. Tax documents missing before suddenly reappearing. Sarah read every line carefully. What do all these events have in common? Margaret frowned. "I don't know." Sarah circled several dates. "Daniel visited your house the same day." Margaret stared at the notebook. Almost every unusual incident had occurred within 24 hours of one of Daniel's unexplained visits. The coincidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Together, they began reviewing the security recordings one date at a time. Most of the cameras showed only Daniel entering and leaving. But one recording revealed something different. The Collins family's camera captured part of Margaret's living room through a large front window. The view wasn't perfect, yet it showed enough. Daniel walked to the bookshelf where Margaret always kept her weekly planner. He removed it, opened several pages, then quietly tore out one sheet. Sarah paused the video. The date. Margaret leaned closer. "My lunch with Linda." Sarah nodded. "The appointment you supposedly forgot." Margaret's heart pounded. "I never forgot." "No." Sarah answered quietly. "Someone removed the reminder." Another recording showed Daniel entering the kitchen. He opened the medicine cabinet. He picked up 2 nearly identical prescription bottles. One for blood pressure medication, the other for vitamins. He carefully switched their positions before closing the cabinet. Margaret covered her mouth. I spent 20 minutes looking for my medication that morning. Sarah looked at her. And who arrived shortly afterward? Margaret didn't need to answer. They both knew. The next video was even more disturbing. Daniel walked through the hallway carrying Margaret's reading glasses. Instead of placing them on the entry table where she always left them, he tucked them behind a decorative vase on the fireplace mantel. Then he stepped back, smiled, and walked away. Margaret felt tears fill her eyes. I knew they weren't there. Sarah gently reached across the table. You weren't imagining it. For months, Margaret had questioned her own memory. Now she understood why. The videos continued. House keys hidden inside a cereal box. The television remote slipped beneath folded towels. A utility bill moved from the kitchen counter into an old recipe book. Nothing expensive was stolen. Nothing permanently disappeared. Every object was simply relocated. Just enough to make an independent woman seem forgetful. Just enough to create doubt. Sarah leaned back slowly. This wasn't random. Margaret nodded. It was rehearsed. But Sarah wasn't finished. If Daniel planned this, he probably planned it long before filing for guardianship. She requested Daniel's phone records and financial disclosures through the court's discovery process. 3 days later, another package arrived. Inside were dozens of text messages exchanged between Daniel and his close friend, Kevin. Sarah began reading. One message, sent nearly 5 months before the guardianship petition, immediately caught her attention. Kevin, have you talked to a lawyer yet? Daniel, not yet. I need everyone to see she's getting worse first. Sarah froze. She kept reading. Weeks later. Daniel, if people think she's confused, the judge won't question me becoming guardian. Another message followed. Kevin, hope she doesn't catch on. Daniel's reply chilled both women. She already doubts herself. Margaret slowly closed her eyes. Those 6 words explained everything. He hadn't been trying to prove she was confused. He had been trying to make her become confused. Sarah quietly organized every document into labeled folders. Medical evidence, security footage, witness statements, phone records, text messages. The stack grew higher with every passing hour. Finally, Margaret asked the question neither of them had spoken aloud. Do you think the judge will believe me? Sarah looked directly into her eyes. The judge doesn't need to believe you. Margaret looked puzzled. He needs to believe the evidence. The morning of the hearing arrived beneath gray skies. The county courthouse buzzed with quiet conversations as families, attorneys, and court staff filled the hallways. Daniel stood confidently outside Courtroom 3. He wore a tailored navy suit. Several relatives surrounded him. One cousin whispered, "You're doing the right thing." Another patted his shoulder. "Your mother is lucky to have you." Daniel smiled modestly. "I'm just trying to protect her." Across the hallway, Margaret sat beside Sarah. Very few people approached them. Most avoided eye contact. Others offered sympathetic smiles reserved for someone believed to be losing touch with reality. Margaret lowered her gaze. "I've already lost before we've even walked inside." Sarah gently touched her arm. "No. You've only lost the opinion of people who don't know the truth." A court clerk opened the courtroom doors. Lawson guardianship hearing. Everyone slowly entered. Daniel walked confidently toward the witness stand. He adjusted his tie, smiled politely at the judge, and raised his right hand to swear the oath, certain that years of careful planning were about to reward him. Completely unaware that, sitting just a few feet away, Sarah possessed enough evidence to unravel every lie he had spent months constructing. The performance Daniel had rehearsed for so long was finally about to meet the truth. Courtroom 3 fell silent as Judge Harold Whitman entered. "Please be seated." Margaret Lawson lowered herself into the wooden chair beside Sarah Mitchell. Across the aisle, Daniel sat confidently with his attorney, his posture calm and composed. To anyone watching, the contrast seemed obvious. A worried son trying to protect his aging mother. An elderly woman refusing to accept reality. Margaret could almost feel the assumptions filling the room before a single witness had spoken. Daniel was called first. After taking the oath, he faced the judge with quiet confidence. "Mr. Lawson," his attorney began, "why are you seeking guardianship over your mother?" Daniel sighed as though carrying a burden he had never wanted. "My mother has always been independent." He paused. "But over the last 2 years, I've watched her slowly disappear." He described forgotten appointments, misplaced bills, repeated conversations. He spoke of nights when Margaret supposedly called him, frightened because she couldn't remember where she had left important documents. "I love my mother," he said, his voice breaking just enough to sound sincere. "I'm not here because I want control. I'm here because she needs someone to protect her." Several people in the gallery nodded sympathetically. Margaret looked down at her folded hands. Every word sounded believable, because every lie contained pieces of the truth. Daniel's attorney then called family members. Margaret's cousin testified first. She repeated the same story 3 times at Thanksgiving. Emily, Margaret's granddaughter, reluctantly admitted, "Grandma has seemed different lately." A neighbor recalled Margaret searching for her car keys one afternoon. Another remembered her arriving late for lunch. Each witness believed they were helping. None of them knew they had only seen the scenes Daniel had carefully arranged. As the testimony continued, Margaret felt herself shrinking. Every ordinary mistake became evidence. Every forgotten object became proof. Even normal aging had been transformed into a diagnosis. Finally, Sarah Mitchell stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to begin with Dr. Alan Foster." The physician walked to the witness stand. After being sworn in, Sarah asked, "Dr. Foster, have you examined Mrs. Lawson?" "Yes." "More than once?" "Yes." "Based on your examinations, has Mrs. Lawson been diagnosed with dementia?" "No." "Alzheimer's disease?" "No." "Moderate cognitive impairment?" "No." The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Sarah continued, "In your professional opinion, is Mrs. Lawson currently incapable of making her own decisions?" Dr. Foster answered firmly, "No. I believe she remains competent." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. For the first time that morning, confidence gave way to discomfort. Sarah called the next witness, Frank Collins. The elderly neighbor carried a small external hard drive to the witness stand. "Mr. Collins," Sarah asked, "do you have security cameras on your property?" "I do." "And do those cameras partially record Mrs. Lawson's driveway?" "Yes." Sarah connected the hard drive to the courtroom monitor. The first video appeared. Daniel unlocking Margaret's front door while she was away. Another recording followed. Then another. The judge leaned forward. Sarah looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Lawson testified he only visited his mother's home when requested." She pressed play again. The timestamps showed otherwise. Day after day. Week after week. Always while Margaret wasn't home. Daniel's attorney immediately stood. "Objection. Simply entering his mother's home proves nothing." "Sustained," the judge replied. "The court will consider only what the footage establishes." Sarah nodded calmly. "I'm glad Your Honor mentioned that." She opened another video. The living room appeared on the courtroom screen. Daniel walked directly to a bookshelf. He removed Margaret's planner, carefully tore out a page, returned the planner, then left. The room fell silent. Sarah displayed the missing calendar page beside the restaurant reservation for Margaret's lunch with Linda. The appointment Mrs. Lawson supposedly forgot. Another recording followed. Daniel quietly placing reading glasses behind a decorative vase. Another. House keys hidden inside a cereal box. Another. Medication bottles switched inside the medicine cabinet. The silence in the courtroom became almost unbearable. No one looked at Margaret anymore. They were looking at Daniel. Sarah approached the witness stand. "Mr. Lawson." She spoke gently. "Can you explain why you repeatedly moved your mother's belongings?" Daniel swallowed. I was testing her memory." Several jurors, though this was a bench hearing, spectators reacted audibly before being hushed, shifted uneasily. The judge's expression hardened. Testing? Daniel nodded nervously. I wanted to know whether she'd notice. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Without her knowledge? I thought it was for her own good. Sarah said nothing. She simply returned to counsel's table, then picked up another folder. Your Honor, I'd like to admit petitioner's text messages into evidence. Daniel's face immediately lost its color. Sarah read aloud. I need everyone to see she's getting worse first. Another message. If people think she's confused, the judge won't question me becoming guardian. Then the final text. She already doubts herself. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Even Daniel's attorney stared at the exhibits without speaking. Sarah closed the folder. These messages were sent months before the guardianship petition. She looked directly at the judge. They reveal planning, not concern. Judge Whitman removed his glasses. He carefully reviewed the evidence spread across his bench. Medical reports, security footage, witness statements, text messages. Then he looked at Margaret. Throughout the hearing she had spoken only when asked. She had never interrupted, never argued, never raised her voice. The very behavior Daniel had described as impossible for her. The judge turned toward Daniel. For the first time since the hearing began, there was no sympathy in his expression, only careful scrutiny. Mr. Lawson, he said quietly, the court has one final matter it wishes to clarify. Daniel straightened in his chair, trying to regain his composure. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Whitman folded his hands. What I ask next will require a very precise answer. The courtroom became perfectly still. Margaret held her breath. Sarah remained motionless. Daniel nodded, unaware that the question about to be asked would dismantle everything he had spent months trying to build. And with a calm, measured voice, Judge Whitman leaned forward to speak. The courtroom was so quiet that Margaret could hear the faint ticking of the clock mounted above the judge's bench. Daniel Lawson sat perfectly still. Only minutes earlier he had appeared calm, certain the hearing was still under his control. His testimony had been polished. His concern had sounded genuine. For years he had built the image of the devoted son willing to sacrifice everything for his aging mother. Now, for the first time, uncertainty crept across his face. Judge Harold Whitman removed his reading glasses and folded his hands. Mr. Lawson, he said evenly, before this court reaches a decision, I have one final question. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked down at the file in front of him. I've reviewed the financial records submitted during discovery. He lifted a document. 3 separate investment agreements. He paused. All signed by Mrs. Margaret Lawson within the last 2 years. Daniel swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. The judge continued. Each agreement transferred significant financial authority and beneficiary interest to you. Daniel nodded cautiously. That is correct. The judge looked directly into his eyes. Now answer this carefully. If your mother has suffered from severe dementia for nearly 2 years, as you have repeatedly testified under oath, why did you persuade her to sign legally binding financial agreements during that same period? Silence. Complete silence. Margaret watched her son's confident expression disappear. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered urgently, but Daniel seemed unable to hear. Judge Whitman repeated the question. If Mrs. Lawson lacked the mental capacity to manage her affairs, she would also lack the legal capacity to execute those investment contracts. He leaned forward. So which is it, Mr. Lawson? Was your mother mentally competent when those documents benefited you? Or mentally incompetent when you sought control of her estate? Every eye in the courtroom remained fixed on Daniel. There was no easy answer. If he insisted Margaret had dementia, then the agreements naming him as beneficiary could be declared legally invalid. If he admitted she had been competent enough to sign them, his entire guardianship petition collapsed. The contradiction was absolute. Daniel's voice cracked. I believed she was declining. Judge Whitman raised an eyebrow. Declining? You testified moments ago that she was incapable of managing her own finances. Those are very different statements. Daniel looked helplessly toward his attorney. His lawyer slowly lowered his eyes. There was nothing left to argue. Sarah Mitchell stood. "Your Honor, may I approach?" The judge nodded. Sarah placed the 3 investment agreements beside Daniel's guardianship petition. These documents were prepared by the same financial advisory firm where Mr. Lawson worked. She turned another page. Each agreement contains a certification stating that Mrs. Lawson fully understood the legal consequences of her signature. Sarah looked toward Daniel. "Did you explain these documents to your mother before asking her to sign them?" "Yes." "And at that time, did you believe she understood them?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes." Sarah's next question came quietly. "So you trusted her judgment when she signed documents benefiting you, but claimed she had no judgment once you sought control over everything else?" Daniel said nothing. He couldn't. Every answer only deepened the contradiction. Judge Whitman sighed heavily. "Mr. Lawson, this court is deeply troubled." He glanced toward the exhibits displayed on the courtroom monitor. "The security recordings demonstrate deliberate interference with your mother's daily routine. The text messages indicate planning. And your own testimony today directly conflicts with legally binding financial documents executed for your personal benefit." He paused before continuing. "The court cannot ignore those facts." Daniel lowered his head. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked less like a confident professional and more like a frightened man watching years of deception unravel in a single afternoon. Margaret remained silent. She had imagined this moment many times. She thought she would feel victorious. Instead, she felt only sadness. This wasn't the son she had raised. She remembered teaching Daniel to ride a bicycle on the quiet street outside their old house. She remembered helping him study for college entrance exams. She remembered the day he proudly received his first job offer. Where had that young man gone? When had love become calculation? The questions hurt more than the accusations ever had. Judge Whitman reached for his gavel. "Based upon the medical testimony, documentary evidence, video recordings, and the petitioner's own inconsistent statements, this court finds no legal basis to appoint a guardian over Mrs. Margaret Lawson." Margaret closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek. Not because she had won. Because someone had finally believed her. The judge continued. "The petition for guardianship is hereby dismissed with prejudice." He paused. "Furthermore, this matter is referred to the Office of the District Attorney for review of potential financial exploitation of an elderly adult, attempted fraud upon the court, and any other violations supported by the evidence." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Daniel's shoulders slumped. His attorney quietly gathered his files without saying a word. The image of the perfect caregiver had vanished. As people slowly filed out of the courtroom, several relatives approached Margaret. Emily stood before her grandmother with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Grandma. I believed him." Margaret gently squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "I know." One by one, neighbors, cousins, and old friends offered quiet apologies. The pity that had once filled their faces had been replaced by shame. Across the room, Daniel stood alone. No one gathered around him anymore. No one praised his devotion. No one called him a hero. He watched silently as his mother walked toward the courtroom doors beside Sarah Mitchell. Just before leaving, Margaret turned back. Their eyes met for only a moment. She saw regret beginning to replace arrogance. But some truths arrived too late. Sarah opened the courthouse door, and warm afternoon sunlight poured inside. Margaret stepped into the light, breathing deeply. For months, people had tried to take away her voice by convincing the world she had lost her mind. Today, the truth had spoken louder than every lie. And although the legal battle was over, both Margaret and Daniel knew another, far more difficult reckoning still awaited them beyond the courthouse steps. 6 months after the guardianship hearing, the courtroom had become little more than a memory. Margaret Lawson was back to driving herself to the grocery store every Saturday morning. She had returned to volunteering at the library, where children still gathered around her during story hour, captivated by the warmth in her voice and the sparkle in her eyes. Life looked ordinary again. But Margaret knew it would never truly be the same. Some wounds healed. Others simply became quieter. The legal investigation into Daniel ended with a negotiated plea agreement. Rather than facing a lengthy criminal trial, he surrendered his financial advisor's license, paid substantial restitution for the legal costs he had caused, and accepted probation under strict court supervision. The judge had been clear. "Your greatest punishment," he had said during sentencing, "is not the record you leave in this courtroom. It is the trust you destroyed outside of it." Daniel never argued. He knew the judge was right. News of the case spread quickly throughout the community. Clients withdrew their investments. Friends stopped calling. Colleagues who had once admired him avoided mentioning his name. The reputation he had spent decades building disappeared in a matter of weeks. Margaret, however, chose a different path. With Sarah Mitchell's encouragement, she established the Lawson Elder Justice Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to protecting older adults from financial manipulation disguised as family care. Every month, attorneys, physicians, and social workers volunteered to teach free workshops. Seniors learned how to recognize coercion, how to safely grant powers of attorney, how to protect their finances. Most importantly, how to trust their own voices. Margaret insisted every seminar begin with the same sentence. Growing older does not mean surrendering your right to make your own decisions. Those words soon appeared on brochures, posters, and community center walls across the county. One autumn afternoon, after finishing a seminar, Sarah approached Margaret carrying a small envelope. It was delivered to my office. No return address. Margaret immediately recognized the handwriting. Daniel. She waited until she arrived home before opening it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "Dear Mom, I spent months convincing everyone that you couldn't trust your own mind. The truth is, I was the one who stopped trusting mine. I convinced myself that debt justified deception, that fear excused manipulation, that becoming your guardian somehow made me a good son. It didn't. Every lie I told about you slowly became the truth about me. If you never forgive me, I understand. But I hope someday you'll remember me for who I was before greed became louder than love. Love. Daniel." By the time Margaret reached the final line, tears blurred the ink. She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside an old photograph of Daniel at 8 years old, proudly holding the first fish he had ever caught with his father. For a long time she simply stared at the picture. She mourned not only the son she had nearly lost, but the years that ambition had stolen from both of them. Several weeks later, Daniel quietly attended one of the foundation's public seminars. He sat in the last row wearing a simple jacket and baseball cap, hoping no one would recognize him. Margaret noticed him almost immediately. She said nothing. Instead, she continued speaking to the audience. Manipulation doesn't always sound cruel. Sometimes it sounds protective. Sometimes it comes wrapped in kindness. And sometimes it comes from someone you love most. The room fell silent. Daniel lowered his head. Every word reached him more deeply than any sentence the judge had ever spoken. When the seminar ended and the audience drifted away, he remained standing alone near the exit. Margaret slowly walked toward him. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Finally Daniel whispered, "I'm sorry. I know those words can't repair what I did." "They can't," Margaret answered gently. "But they're where repairing begins." He looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "You still believe I can become a better man?" Margaret smiled sadly. "I have to. Because if a mother stops believing redemption is possible, then she loses far more than a courtroom case." Daniel broke down, covering his face with trembling hands. For the first time in years, Margaret embraced her son. Not because trust had been restored. It hadn't. Not because the past had disappeared. It never would. She embraced him because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness is given. Trust is earned. Months later, Margaret was invited to speak at the state's annual conference on elder justice. The auditorium was filled with judges, attorneys, caregivers, physicians, and hundreds of older adults. As she stepped to the podium, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Margaret waited until the applause faded. Then she smiled. "There was a time," she began, "when my own son convinced people that I had lost my voice." She paused. "He almost succeeded. But here's what I learned. The greatest danger of growing older isn't forgetting where you placed your keys. It's allowing someone else to convince the world that your life no longer belongs to you." The audience listened in complete silence. Margaret looked across the room where Sarah Mitchell sat proudly in the front row. Near the back, unnoticed by almost everyone else, Daniel stood quietly watching. He wasn't there as a son seeking recognition. He was there as a man learning, one day at a time, how to deserve the title again. Margaret smiled softly before speaking her final words. "Never let anyone mistake your age for your worth. Because dignity isn't something another person can sign away. It belongs to you for as long as you have the courage to protect it." The auditorium erupted in applause. And this time, every voice rose for the woman they had once tried to silence.